Hi folks, number 13 here with a very special bonus episode. If you listened to last week's episode about the Charley Ross kidnapping, you may remember some weird stuff at the end with fake Charley Rosses popping up out of the woodwork. If you don't remember, here's a quick recap. In 1932, Gustave Blair, a carpenter from Illinois, announced that he was the long-lost Charley Ross. He claimed he had been kidnapped, hidden in a cave, and then smuggled into the Midwest, where he was fostered by farmers. Unlike previous claimants, Blair tried to prove his identity through legal means, presenting his case in a Maricopa County, Arizona court in 1939. After only a few hours of testimony and deliberation, the court rubber-stamped Blair's claims, and he legally became Charles Brewster Ross. At the start of the legal proceedings, Blair claimed that he only wanted to reconnect with his siblings and had no interest in money. After the verdict, he immediately tried to claim his share of the Ross family fortune. He never saw a dime because, as it turns out, it had never existed. Blair died in 1943 and took the secret of his true identity with him to the grave. Or did he? While researching the Charley Ross story, I stumbled across the work of Rod Miller. Rod grew up in a family of 10 boys and 3 girls in Mason City, Iowa. He holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Northern Iowa, settled in Minneapolis 35 years ago with his life partner, and retired from the mental health profession in 2011. His interest in geneaology began in 1977 when his father removed a black satchel from a mildewed cardboard drum in his wet basement, handed it to him, and said, "This is Charley Ross." Rod and his nephew Larry Miller followed up on that lead, and while they didn't find out what happened to Charley Ross, they sure found out who Gustave Blair was. I conducted a Skype interview with Rod and May, and what follows is an edited version of that interview. A warning. While reviewing a rough cut of the audio, Rod and Larry noticed 2 small mistakes. I didn't quite have the coverage to edit around them, but I worked some audio wizardry and I don't think you'll even notice. Enjoy. Who are you, and what is your relationship to Gustave Blair?
Well, I'm a descendant of the Miller family that was allegedly involved in the kidnapping of Charley Ross. Gustave Blair is the man who declared he was Charley Ross in 1939. And he won that title in a court in Maricopa County, Arizona.
So it is Gustave and not Gustave, huh?
Yeah, Gustave, I think it can be pronounced either way. I've always said Gustave.
It's your family, so you're the expert.
Okay.
What did Gustave claim happened to him as a child?
He claimed that he was actually born in Pennsylvania and that he was kidnapped and taken to a cave and was later brought to Lee County, Illinois, to the home of the Millers, which is my family. And he claims that he was raised as their own child and was given the name of Nelson Miller after a child that had been deceased in the family.
Now, if I understand it correctly, his story is that when he was first kidnapped, he was taken by a man named John Hawk or John Hawks.
The man's name was John Hawk. And this was a man who we know was living just down the road from the Miller family as a farm laborer. And he lived in the home of a man by the name of Robert Blair. The story is that John Hawk had to return to Philadelphia to retrieve his dead sister's child. And he convinced Rainier Miller, the patriarch of the Miller family, to allow one of his sons to go with him to give company to this little child as he brought him back in a wagon. The son that went with him was called Lincoln Miller. So Lincoln and John Hawk reportedly went by train to Philadelphia. And instead of going into the town, they went to a cave outside of the city, and there was a child being kept in the cave. But the child said his name was Charley Ross. John Hawk and Lincoln brought the child in a buggy from that cave to Lee County, Illinois, and they dressed the child as a girl to conceal his identity. As the story develops, when it came time for John Hawk to take the child back for the ransom, the Millers had grown attached to the child and refused to let him go. There was an argument between John Hawk and Rainier Miller, and Rainier grabbed a shotgun from the corner in the kitchen, and as Hawk went up the stairs to get the child, Rainier Miller shot and killed him. and then buried him in the backyard. Well, that story is really good. It's a dramatic story. It's sworn testimony in a court of law. It's sworn on an affidavit, on a deathbed confession that that's what happened. So Hawk was supposedly killed in 1874, 1875 at the latest, when he tried to take the child for the ransom. But the point of this is we know that that's not true, because in the 1880 census, John Hawk is still reported on the census as a laborer in the Robert Blair farm right up the road from the Millers. He could not have been killed by Rainier Miller. It's very convoluted and complicated and difficult to track, but that's the essential story of what Gustave Blair says happened to him as a child, and that he was raised by the Millers after John Hawk was killed by his Miller father, which is what he called him later. He made very conflicting statements about when he learned the truth about his identity. He said at one time he learned as early as age 16, and then another time in an interview in a newspaper, he claimed he was 36 years old.
What would his life as Nelson Miller been like?
He described his childhood in his own words when he gave testimony in one of his criminal trials. He had 2 criminal trials and went to prison from both of them. But the trial that occurred in Fresno, California in 1910, he told the court that he was in fact born in Lee County, Illinois, as Nelson Miller, and that he didn't have a good education, and that he didn't even finish common school, and that he dropped out of school when he was 12 or 13 years old to work on the farm. We also know that when he was 8 years old, his parents divorced, and Rainier Miller, his Miller father, actually filed for divorce, claiming that he was physically and verbally abused by his wife, and that she had been violent and had battered him in the home. So it's likely that Nelson grew up in a home where there was violence, domestic violence. When after the divorce, shortly after that, he left his father's home and all the 11 boys that lived there, and he went to live with a cousin on a farm in Lee County. And then he says he left home and he built fences in rural Iowa and in Minnesota for 10 years until he was convicted of this crime and imprisoned for 7 years for essentially obtaining property by false pretense.
Do we know what led him to turn to a life of crime, so to speak?
His brother, Lincoln Miller, who later became his only witness at his trial, it was in California at the time that Nelson was arrested. And Lincoln was arrested with him too. And essentially Lincoln threw him under the bus and said that this man is a criminal, and he's extorted $62,000 even from me, his brother, because I trusted and gave him and advanced him money for his real estate deals and all of these frauds that he was involved in. And he said that this man is evil, that he abandoned his family, he ran off with another man's wife, and he even stole from me. We know that he has a lengthy criminal history. He served time in Fresno, California, and he came back. He was released, and he was paroled to the custody of his brother, which is my grandfather. And that brother that he was paroled to was just released from Fort Madison prison in Iowa for stealing property by false pretenses. He wrote a check for a car that was bad. And shortly after that, he was arrested again in a little town in
Minnesota
and charged with sodomy of a 14-year-old boy. He was in jail for 6 months pending trial, and the case was dismissed because the boy would not testify. So the case was dismissed, and he left there and then went another crime spree and was arrested in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and there was tried and convicted of real estate fraud and a number of other extortion and forgery claims, and served 3 years in the state penitentiary in South Dakota.
By the time he gets caught in Aberdeen, he's using the name Gustave Blair?
At some point, and I believe after the sodomy arrest, when he emerged from that, the next run-in that we find with him on public record, he is going by the name Gustave Blair. So we think he changed his name and just probably assumed a name. I don't think it was any real person. I don't think he really related it to the Blair family in Lee County. I just think he took the name. And that's the name that he was arrested in South Dakota. And that's where we know publicly where he first was going by the name of Gustave Blair.
Now, I could not find a lot about Gustave's activities in the 20s. Were they a quiet time?
After he was paroled from South Dakota, he sort of went silent. We trace that he went back to Illinois, and we find that there's some public record of some real estate transactions that he was involved in. Again, more of his theme of fraud and real estate. When in Aberdeen, he attempted to steal considerable amounts of property from farmers in which he was going to do a development. He issued false titles and real estate documents as collateral for the money that they gave him to fund the development. It's this type of fraud. We find that he was still dealing with that kind of activity when he was released in the early 20s and through the 20s. And we find some evidence of real estate transactions in Rockford, Illinois, and in Lee County. And some of those involve transfer of property to his biological children. He married a woman by the name of Ida Johnson, and they had these 6 children. But we have no documentation that he actually divorced her. We think when he married a woman by the name of Cora Eversole in 1929, that he actually was committing bigamy because there was no evidence that he ever divorced his first wife.
So in 1932 is when Gustave and his family start to make the claim that he is Charley Ross. I believe the first person to raise it is his son Ralph. What led Ralph to raise the claim?
Well, see, Ralph was another character who is a twice convicted felon and imprisoned twice as well. During this period of time, he was in Washington State, and he was involved with several real estate transactions. Again, he was known to be a realtor. And there was some evidence that he was under suspicion for criminal activity or fraud in the real estate company. He left Seattle and went to Canada, where he supposedly ran a hotel for a period of time. And when he tried to come back, he had no document to prove his name was Ralph Blair. That's where the story was first announced at the border, that he was not Ralph Blair, he was Ralph Miller, and that his real father was Charley Ross, who was going by the name of Gustave Blair, who was also going by the name of Nelson Miller. It was the most convoluted story anybody could ever imagine. Gustave hired an attorney, and they were able to convince the Border Patrol that there was credibility in this story, and they let Ralph back in. So it's a very bizarre way for this story to come out. We do suspect that it was not just immediately contrived, and that this was probably a story that was being developed all along, and it just was used prematurely to get Ralph back into the country. But they gave no definitive evidence of Gustave Blair, in fact, being Charley Ross. They said he had the physical characteristics of the Ross family. Specifically, he had one ear thicker and set lower on the head than other people, and that was characteristic of the family. I'm serious, it's in the newspaper.
I know, I've read it, and I still makes me laugh every time. It's like my one ear is a little lower than the others, so clearly we're related. Do you have any guesses what might have led the Millers to come up with the idea to pretend that Gustave was Charley Ross, other than the fact that obviously their ages are about correct and one ear is lower than the other?
I just think it was all motivated by money. I think that there were 3 or 4 of the Millers, Lincoln, Harrison, my grandfather, and Nelson and Andrew Miller, and Lafayette, another one, had a very significant criminal streak. And why all of a sudden did they decide this? I think it was 1932 that Charles Lindbergh, the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's child, happened. And I think maybe it just came to their mind that they could maybe piggyback on that concept and claim to solve a 65-year-old mystery of what happened to Charley Ross. We can only speculate. We just really don't know.
That might also explain why they bring it back up again in 1935 while the Hauptmann trial is going on.
Exactly.
From 1935, it sounds like it takes him about 4 years to get his act together, and he goes to prove that he is Charley Ross in a court of law in Maricopa County, Arizona. Why would he have picked Arizona?
But it was chosen because of liberal statutes in the state of Arizona on proving identity. And it was there that he could convince a jury just based on testimony and no physical documented evidence. I have a transcript of the trial, which is just kind of mind-blowing. His attorney read into the record a number of pages from Christian Ross's book about the kidnapping of his child. And then Nelson Miller gave his testimony at Gustave Blair. And then they wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair this very old, sickly, dying-looking man wrapped in a blanket, Lincoln Miller, who on his near deathbed gave testimony to this whole convoluted story. And just from our research, if the trial was happening today, it probably never would have been heard because we have clear evidence that they were lying under oath and that the story is not true. And Lincoln, he swore out an affidavit before the trial, and he called it his deathbed confession. He even said in the introduction that the doctor gave him a very limited time to live, so it was important for him to get this off his chest and to tell the world the truth of what happened to his brother.
When did Lincoln actually pass away?
He didn't die until 1954.
It's a pretty nice long life for someone who was on his deathbed from 1934 to 1939.
Exactly. It was 1945 that he actually died.
Why do you think he made the deathbed confession? My thought was that dying declarations by criminals are usually given additional weight in a court of law because the person knows they're dying and they have no reason to lie.
So I think you're right. It was convincing. Just the appearance and the concept of a person dying would tell the truth, has no reason to lie. So I think that was part of what was going on. I didn't mention this to you, but I learned about this story from my father when he took me into the basement of our home in Mason City, Iowa, and took out of this old cardboard, mildewed, wet drum a stack of papers and handed it to me and said, "This is the story of Charley Ross." That's all he said. So I took it home, and they were damp, mildewed, they stunk. There were 234 pages that I laid out all over the house to get them to dry out. And that's where I found the murder confession, Lincoln's confession, and affidavits from, I think, 8 or 9 people that supposedly were sworn in front of notaries, including the murder confession. They all looked pretty legitimate, and they all looked scholarly, legally written. Well, we know that my grandfather and the brother of Nelson Miller, my grandfather was Harrison, was a practicing lawyer in St. Paul. So it's very likely that he drafted, actually maybe even fabricated or wrote these confessions. And Nelson took them to these people and maybe paid them off or convinced them to sign them. Or they were never signed in front of a notary. The notary signatures were forged because we know this group of people were good forgers and obtained property by a false pretense and typically through forged signatures and documents. So all of those documents that were handed to me by my father, we call that the Black Satchel. And in that was a book that my grandfather was writing called Hunting for the Lost Charley Ross. And it's based on Christian Ross's book, kind of a restatement of that book. But the second half of the book about Nelson Miller and Gustave Blair was reportedly stolen. We think Harrison, Lincoln, Nelson contrived this story, that Harrison was this legally, lawyerly person who was going to draft all these documents for trial. So we think there was a falling out between the brothers. My personal thought is that my grandfather probably learned of the sodomy arrest in Minnesota and wanted nothing more to do with Nelson Miller and sort of abandoned him in the midst of all of this. So instead of using all of those affidavits that my grandfather wrote, they relied on the testimony of Lincoln.
It's interesting to me that they went to the trouble of drafting affidavits. I think people tend to assume that affidavits, because they're sworn, have some sort of binding force or legal power. But in reality, the only legal power they have is to get you indicted if you actually lie in an affidavit.
Exactly. I mean, it's a setup for perjury. We're not sure why, but we know that Gustave Blair, after 1935, building up to the trial, told reporters on several occasions that he had the proof. He had 12 sworn affidavits from key witnesses, including the family, that could prove his case. And he said that several times, but not a single one of them were entered as evidence. Either the person who wrote them, my grandfather and Nelson's brother, said, if you use them, I'm going to blow you out of the water. I'm going to say they're all a fraud. It's possible that because the brothers had this falling out, that they couldn't use the affidavits. Some of them we were able to trace that there was an actual magistrate of the court or the equivalency of a notary public, but we can't find an original signature to compare them. And among these affidavits was the sworn confession of Rainier Miller that he wrote in 1904. And was signed by this judge magistrate. Well, we found that magistrate in Lee County, but we could not find a signature from the magistrate. We took that manuscript, that typed confession signed by Rainier and this magistrate, and we sent it to a forensic typesetter, and they determined that the typeset used to write that affidavit did not appear until 1930.
Did his sons ever present any sort of rationale for why Rainier Miller would swear out an affidavit that he had killed John Hawk, a crime for which, as far as I can tell, no one had even suspected him of?
Nelson said that Rainier told him the truth, that he was Charley Ross and that he killed John Hawk, so that Nelson would not testify in court against his father over a land fraud deal that was happening in Lee County. It's just another criminal activity. He was also said he couldn't tell anyone until his father died, and Rainier Miller died in 1920. So he waited another 12 years to tell about this story. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But why would Lincoln and Harrison, why wouldn't they object to this affidavit and that there's no reason for him to confess to the killing until this story emerged about John Hawk bringing the child from Philadelphia? What the Millers didn't know is that John Hawk was still alive in 1880. They didn't know that at the time because the census data wasn't available. It is now. What put the icing on the cake for our investigation was DNA evidence. And a man by the name of Tom Everly, I don't know if you've found his manuscript, it's probably the most well-researched investigation into the Charley Ross kidnapping and the Gustave Blair connection. At the end of his study, of his investigation, he approached the Ross family and asked them if they would participate in a DNA study that would settle this once and for all. And the Ross family didn't even respond to him, so the idea just died. When we connected with Tom and we discussed this, then we decided that we didn't need the Rosses to participate in a DNA study because we could use Y-DNA testing that could in fact prove Gustave Blair was not Charley Ross. A man's ancestry can be traced by the DNA on his Y chromosome. The Y chromosome passes down almost unchanged from father to son in generations from male lineage. A man who is tested using Y DNA, those results compared to another man will determine if those two people are related. So if the tests are perfect or nearly perfect, then they are in fact siblings or related, father, son, or brother. And that's exactly what we did. We found two male descendants from Nelson Miller and Harrison Miller, my grandfather, and they provided DNA, and we used chain of custody procedures, so it's not going to be argued that we contaminated the result. We collected the DNA from these two suspected brothers, and the analysis determined that there was a 99.99903 probability of kinship, and that Nelson Miller was, in fact, a brother of Harrison Miller. He could not have been a Ross.
Sounds pretty open and shut.
That's where we're at now, is to get the truth out that this whole convoluted story, for whatever motivation, for whatever reason, and essentially we think the bottom line was this is a family of thieves, and it was money. Gustave Blair thought he was going to hone in on $490,000 trust in the Ross family that he even announced in one of his interviews. He wasn't interested in it, but he knew that he had an inheritance and he was going to go back to get it. There's no evidence that he ever pursued it legally in a court of law or that he got any money, because it was well known that Christian Ross had depleted all of his resources over the years to find Charley Ross, and there was no Ross fortune.
That seems like something you might want to check first before you come up with your crazy story.
I think so. That's essentially the story of Gustave Blair, and we think it was a lot of deceit. There is some theory that maybe Nelson Miller was a patsy in all of this, that he was perhaps persuaded by his older brothers that he was in fact Charley Ross, and this story was given to him, and that he was being used and manipulated by them, and he was a victim. I just have a hard time with that because of his entire criminal history. He was not a passive participant in crime. He was an active participant. He served 2 prison sentences and was arrested on a sex offense with a child. So I just don't buy this theory that he was a patsy, that he was a pawn, that he was manipulated and a victim of the criminal minds of his siblings. My partner in this investigation, that's still a plausible theory, and it is actually what Nelson Miller's surviving descendants believe.
When did you do the Y-DNA testing?
That we did that in 2011. What we've been doing since is trying to find a medium to report the results. We toyed with a book. And right in 2011, if you remember, Carrie Hagan published her book on the Charley Ross kidnapping. It was called We Is Got Him. And the opinion was there was not a market for another Charley Ross book. And we would just be repeating a lot of the Charley Ross story to report the findings of our DNA study. We were contacted by another author. Her name was Kara Hughes, and she wrote a book, Myths and Mysteries in Pennsylvania History. And she's publishing a second edition, and she's going to devote one chapter on Charley Ross. And so she collaborated with us to cite our research and to get it into this publication, which will be out next fall.
What do you think really happened to Charley Ross?
I wish I really knew. So it's likely that the person who was caring for the child, hiding the child, was given instructions to kill the child if, in fact, they were apprehended before the ransom was paid. And they even said that in the ransom notes. So I suspect that that's probably what happened. Now, Carrie Hagan, I mentioned her book, she proposed a theory as well that I totally agree with, and I collaborated and discussed this with her, is that we believe Charley Ross was hidden in plain sight as one of the Mosier's 6 children. Now, what's interesting is that Martha's brother was
William
Westerfeld. Westerfeld was the only person that went to trial regarding the Charley Ross kidnapping, and he was convicted of conspiracy, and he was sent to prison for 8 years. And we think that even though he went to trial, he probably allowed that to happen rather than to reveal that, in fact, his sister was involved, and his sister had hidden and probably killed Charley Ross. I wish, David, I had some definitive answer, but
well, maybe it's good that we have a little mystery out there.
There's some things that could be pursued. For instance, with this whole John Hawk being buried in the Miller homestead, or in fact maybe Charley Ross, a boy's body being buried in the backyard because he died from this disease. So I was contacting forensic laboratories that could go to the site and to do a survey of the farmstead for evidence of cadavers, and that could do a forensic investigation of are there any bodies buried in that lot. Before we could initiate this forensic investigation, the house was torn down 6 months before, and the land was tilled into farmland. So any forensic evidence would have been destroyed and dispersed just 6 months before we considered this option. So that might have answered a lot of questions, but it's too late for that. I went to Phoenix, and I found the grave, Charles B. Ross, a very plain marker, and you saw it on our document. And so this man went to his grave and buried himself as a person he was not, either believing he was, or he just couldn't confess that he deceived the world. He just went to his grave with the secret.
Thank you for your time, Rod.
All right, take care of yourself.
If you have any interest in learning more about the true story of Gustave Blair, go check out Rod and Larry's website at charleyross.com. And while you're at it, keep an eye out for the second edition of Kara Yu's Myths and Mysteries of Pennsylvania, True Stories of the Unsolved and Unexplained, coming this fall. Until next time, quid minime sciant, optime scire. This episode was produced by Rod Miller for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope and That's Not Canon Productions. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. A transcript of this episode can be found at orderthejackalope.com. That's orderthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Do you have thoughts about this episode? Why not head on over to our Discord server and share them? There's a link in the show notes. Or reach out to us on social media. We can be found at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Reddit, and Facebook. If social media is not your thing, you can always send us an old-fashioned email at jackalope@orderthejackalope.com. We're looking for new lodge members. We'll initiate anyone into the secret mysteries. All you have to do is share a secret mystery of your own first. Go visit our website and click Join Us for more information.